The Yukon is larger than many countries, yet fewer than 50,000 people live here. And if you think this territory is nothing more than cold wilderness and empty forests, you're about to miss the landscapes that make the Yukon feel almost unreal. In this journey, we'll travel through remote mountain valleys, historic gold rush routes, and roads leading toward the Arctic Circle. And the farther north we go, the more unreal the landscapes become. And before we reach those places, there are a few things about the Yukon that make this territory even more fascinating. Because despite how remote it feels today, there was a time when people flooded into the Yukon by the tens of thousands. In 1896, gold was discovered near the Klondike region, triggering one of the largest gold rushes in North American history. Within months, people from all over the world began heading north. Some traveled thousands of kilometers, thousands of miles, through brutal terrain, freezing temperatures, and dangerous mountain passes. Many arrived completely unprepared. There are stories of stampeders abandoning heavy equipment along the trails because they simply couldn't carry it anymore. Others survived on little more than beans, flour, and whatever wild game they could hunt. One old Yukon saying claimed that during the harshest periods, people became so desperate they would boil leather just to have something warm to eat. And what makes this story even stranger is that the gold rush lasted only a few intense years, but it permanently changed the Yukon forever. Small frontier settlements suddenly became booming towns filled with saloons, gambling halls, dance halls, and muddy streets crowded with prospectors dreaming of becoming rich overnight. But here's the part many people don't realize. For most prospectors, the real gold wasn't found in the rivers. It was made by the people selling supplies. Some merchants became extremely wealthy simply by selling food, tools, or warm clothing to desperate miners arriving from the south. And even today, parts of the Yukon still carry that frontier atmosphere. There's a toughness here that feels very different from most of modern Canada. Locals are used to huge distances, harsh winters, and solving problems on their own. In smaller communities, it's still normal for people to carry survival gear in their vehicles during winter because weather conditions can change incredibly fast. Temperatures in some parts of the Yukon can drop below minus 40 degrees Celsius. That's also minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the rare point where both scales actually meet. At those temperatures, exposed skin can freeze in minutes. Car engines are often plugged into heaters overnight just so they can start in the morning. And then there's the darkness. During winter, some northern parts of the Yukon receive only a few hours of daylight. The sun barely rises above the horizon before disappearing again. But during summer, the opposite happens. Around the June solstice, daylight can last nearly all night. Some people describe it as disorienting at first. Others absolutely love it. Locals sometimes joke that summer in the Yukon is so short that people try to enjoy every possible second of it. Campgrounds fill up, fishing boats appear on the lakes, and hiking trails suddenly become busy after months of snow and cold. Wildlife also plays a huge role in daily life here. The Yukon is home to grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, lynx, moose, mountain goats, caribou, and massive herds of Dall sheep. And unlike many places farther south, animals here still genuinely dominate the landscape. Moose are especially important to Yukon culture. Adult males can weigh more than 600 kilograms, that's over 1,300 pounds, and stand taller than many people expect. Collisions with moose are taken very seriously because these animals are so large that accidents can become deadly. But the wildlife stories become even more intense farther north. Some remote workers and hunters describe hearing wolves at night with absolutely no artificial light anywhere around them. No highways, no cities, just endless wilderness stretching for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. And this isolation changes people. Many who move to the Yukon say they originally came for one season and ended up staying for years. Some were attracted by mining jobs, others by tourism, photography, or the simple idea of living somewhere that still feels truly wild. One local description of the Yukon says, "The land decides whether your plans happen or not." And honestly, that feeling still exists here. Snowstorms can suddenly close highways. Rivers can become dangerous after heavy rain. Wildfires sometimes affect enormous areas during dry summers. Nature still has the final word. The scale of the territory makes that even easier to understand. The Yukon covers nearly 483,000 square kilometers. That's about 186,000 square miles, making it larger than countries like Germany or Japan. Yet almost all of the population lives in just a handful of communities connected by long, remote highways. And some of those highways are famous for how isolated they feel. Drivers often carry extra fuel, food, spare tires, and emergency supplies because help can be extremely far away. On certain roads, it's completely normal to drive for long stretches without phone signal. But strangely, that isolation is exactly what many people love most about the Yukon. Because in a world filled with traffic, crowds, and constant noise, the Yukon still offers something increasingly rare: silence, real silence. the kind where you can hear wind moving across a valley or water, hitting the shoreline from far away. And the farther north you go, the more that feeling grows. Soon, we'll begin exploring the places that make the Yukon unforgettable, from glacier-covered mountains and historic frontier towns to roads leading deep into the Arctic wilderness. And some of the landscapes ahead honestly look almost impossible to believe. Whitehorse might feel small compared to most North American cities, but it's surprisingly important once you realize where you are. This is the largest community in the Yukon, home to roughly 30,000 people, which means most of the territory's population is concentrated right here. And despite the remote location, Whitehorse has a surprisingly active atmosphere during summer. Float planes pass overhead, hikers prepare for multi-day trips, and old riverfront areas still carry traces of the Gold Rush era. What's interesting is that the city was originally shaped by the Yukon River. Before highways connected the region, sternwheelers transported people and supplies through this harsh landscape. Some of those historic riverboats can still be seen today, including the famous SS Klondike, which once carried cargo during the final years of river transportation in the north. Whitehorse also has one unusual advantage compared to many northern settlements. The climate here is actually relatively dry. The surrounding mountains block a lot of Pacific moisture, giving the city far more sunshine than many people expect. But just outside the city, the Yukon immediately starts feeling far wilder. Miles Canyon looks calm today, but during the Klondike Gold Rush, this narrow section of the Yukon River was one of the most dangerous obstacles prospectors faced on their journey north. Before the river was dammed in the 1950s, powerful rapids crashed through the canyon, destroying boats and killing inexperienced travelers trying to reach the goldfields. The canyon itself was formed by ancient volcanic activity. Dark basalt walls rise sharply above the turquoise water, creating a landscape that feels surprisingly dramatic considering how close it is to Whitehorse. The color of the river comes from glacial silt carried down from the surrounding mountains, and on sunny days, the water almost glows against the black rock. One of the most famous stories from here involves stampeders hiring experienced Indigenous guides to help navigate the rapids. Those who tried crossing alone often regretted it. Some boats were smashed within minutes. Others disappeared entirely into the current. And not far from here, the Yukon reveals another side entirely. Yukon Wildlife Preserve offers something surprisingly rare in the north, the chance to see some of the Yukon's most iconic animals without needing to disappear deep into the wilderness for days. Spread across more than 280 hectares, nearly 700 acres, the preserve is home to species that many visitors dream of seeing in the wild, but often never do. And some of these animals are far larger than people expect. Wood bison, for example, can weigh over 900 kilograms, almost 2,000 pounds, making them the largest land mammals in North America. The preserve also protects animals deeply connected to northern life and indigenous culture. Including caribou, muskoxen, mountain goats, elk, lynx, and moose. One animal people often hope to spot here is the Canada lynx. They're surprisingly difficult to see in the wild despite living across huge parts of the north. But farther north, the landscape becomes less controlled, less predictable, and much more open. Lake Laberge doesn't immediately look dangerous. At first glance, it seems peaceful. A massive lake surrounded by quiet northern wilderness, roughly 50 kilometers north of Whitehorse. That's about 30 miles. But this lake has a reputation for sudden storms that has lasted for generations. Strong winds can build quickly here, creating rough waves across the long, narrow body of water. During the Gold Rush era, prospectors traveling north along the Yukon River dreaded this crossing. Small wooden boats overloaded with supplies were especially vulnerable once the weather changed. The lake became even more famous through Robert Service's poem, The Cremation of Sam McGee, one of the best-known pieces of Yukon literature. But there's another reason this lake feels memorable. The scenery here captures a quieter side of the Yukon. Bald eagles circle overhead, forests stretch down to the shoreline, and during calm evenings, the water can reflect the sky almost perfectly. Ibex Valley sits only a short drive from Whitehorse, but it already feels far removed from city life. This broad valley is known for its quiet ranchlands, open forests, and mountain scenery. But what makes it especially interesting is how quickly the landscape changes once you leave the highway behind. Dirt roads lead toward hidden lakes, small cabins, and trails used by locals for hiking, horseback riding, and snowmobiling during winter. The valley gets its name from the Siberian ibex, even though those animals were never native to the Yukon. Early settlers simply thought the rugged terrain resembled landscapes where ibex lived elsewhere in the world. Today, the area is more associated with moose and black bears than anything else. Kusawa Lake stretches for more than 70 kilometers. That's over 43 miles, through a landscape of mountains, forests, and glacial valleys southwest of Whitehorse. Unlike many famous lakes in southern Canada, Kusawa still feels remarkably undeveloped. There are no large resorts here, no crowded marinas, and very few permanent settlements along the shoreline. The lake itself was formed by glaciers thousands of years ago, and its narrow shape follows the surrounding mountain valleys almost like a flooded canyon. During summer, people come here to fish for lake trout and Arctic grayling, while kayakers and boaters explore the quieter coves hidden along the shoreline. But this place also has a much older history. For generations, Southern Tutchone people traveled through this region long before roads existed. Later, during the Gold Rush era, parts of the lake became connected to transportation routes, bringing prospectors farther into the Yukon interior. One interesting detail is how dramatically the weather can change here. Calm, sunny conditions can suddenly turn windy once cold air begins descending from the surrounding mountains. Those same mountains eventually rise into one of the largest protected wilderness regions anywhere in North America. Kluane National Park and Reserve protects some of the most extreme landscapes in Canada. The park covers nearly 22,000 square kilometers. That's roughly 8,500 square miles, and contains enormous glaciers, massive ice fields, and some of the highest mountains on the continent. And what's surprising is how little of it can actually be reached by road. Most of the park remains completely wild, accessible only by hiking, aircraft, or multi-day expeditions. From the air, the scale becomes almost difficult to process. Rivers of ice stretch across entire valleys, while sharp peaks rise above the clouds. This region also contains the largest non-polar ice field on Earth. In some places, the ice is hundreds of meters thick and still actively shaping the landscape below it. Glaciers grind rock into fine powder that later gives many Yukon lakes and rivers their unusual turquoise color. Wildlife here is equally impressive. Dall sheep move across steep mountain slopes, grizzly bears roam the valleys, and enormous herds of caribou migrate through parts of the region. Because the park is so large and remote, animals can still move across vast distances with relatively little human interference. Kathleen Lake is one of those places that immediately makes people stop the car. The lake sits near the edge of the massive Kluane wilderness, and on calm days, the surrounding mountains reflect so clearly in the water that the landscape almost looks inverted. What gives the lake its intense color is glacial flour, tiny particles of rock ground down by nearby glaciers and suspended in the water. Sunlight reflects off these particles, creating the striking turquoise shades that make many Yukon lakes look almost unreal in photographs. But unlike heavily visited alpine lakes farther south, Kathleen Lake still feels remarkably quiet. There's also a surprising amount of wildlife here. Grizzly bears and black bears move through the surrounding forests, while Dall sheep can sometimes be spotted high on the nearby slopes. During autumn, strong winds sweep across the valley, and the changing tundra colors create deep reds and yellows along the shoreline. Carcross Desert is often called the smallest desert in the world, which sounds almost impossible considering its location deep in northern Canada. Surrounded by mountains and cold lakes, this patch of wind-blown sand feels completely out of place. The area itself is relatively small, covering about 2.6 square kilometers, roughly 1 square mile, but the landscape is striking. What's interesting is that technically, this isn't a true desert. The Yukon doesn't receive the extremely low rainfall needed for official desert classification. Instead, these dunes are leftovers from a large glacial lake that existed thousands of years ago. As the ancient lake disappeared, strong winds began picking up exposed sand and shaping the dunes that remain today. The nearby community of Carcross also has deep Indigenous roots connected to the Carcross, Tagish First Nation, whose history in the region stretches back long before the arrival of European prospectors. Today, the area has become popular for hiking, sandboarding, and mountain biking on the surrounding trails. Emerald Lake almost doesn't look natural when the sun hits it properly. The water glows with an intense green color that feels more tropical than northern Canadian. And unlike many glacier-fed lakes that appear turquoise, Emerald Lake gets its unusual shade from marl, a white, mineral-rich sediment reflecting sunlight beneath the shallow water. The lake sits along the South Klondike Highway and has become one of the most photographed places in the Yukon. But despite its popularity, the area still feels relatively quiet compared to famous lakes farther south in Banff or Jasper. Early mornings are especially peaceful, when mist drifts across the water and the roads are nearly empty. And not far from here, an old railway line begins climbing through steep mountain passes that once decided who reached the Klondike goldfields and who turned back. White Pass and Yukon Route was built during one of the most chaotic periods in Yukon history. When news of gold spread across North America in the late 1890s, thousands of prospectors rushed north toward the Klondike. But reaching the goldfields was far harder than many expected. The White Pass route quickly became infamous. Prospectors struggled through mud, snow, freezing winds, and steep mountain terrain while carrying enormous amounts of supplies required by Canadian authorities. Pack animals often died along the trail, giving part of the route the grim nickname Dead Horse Trail. To solve the transportation problem, engineers built this narrow-gauge railway through the mountains between Alaska and the Yukon. And considering the terrain, the construction was remarkable. Workers blasted tunnels through rock, built wooden trestle bridges above cliffs, and carved tracks directly into steep mountain slopes. Even today, the railway journey feels dramatic. And after crossing these rugged mountain routes, the story of the Yukon eventually returns to the river that shaped nearly everything here in the first place. Yukon River stretches for more than 3,000 kilometers, nearly 2,000 miles, from British Columbia through the Yukon and deep into Alaska before finally reaching the Bering Sea. For centuries, it served as one of the most important transportation routes in the north. Long before highways existed, Indigenous communities used the river for travel, trade, fishing, and seasonal migration. Later, during the Gold Rush era, sternwheelers carried enormous amounts of cargo and thousands of prospectors along its waters. Entire towns depended on the river for survival. What surprises many people is how calm large sections of the river actually appear. In some places, the Yukon River becomes incredibly wide and slow-moving, reflecting forests and mountains like glass. But hidden beneath that calm surface is an immense amount of power. Seasonal flooding, shifting currents, and dangerous rapids have shaped life along the river for generations. Fishing also remains deeply important here. Chinook salmon once migrated thousands of kilometers upstream from the ocean, creating one of the longest salmon migrations on Earth. Although salmon populations have declined in recent years, the river still plays a central role in northern culture and ecology. And farther downstream, one section of the river became so dangerous during the gold rush that terrified travelers sometimes stopped completely before attempting to pass through it. Five Finger Rapids earned its reputation long before modern navigation existed in the north. Here, the Yukon River narrows and crashes between large rock pillars, creating powerful currents and dangerous waves that terrified gold rush travelers heading toward Dawson City. Before a safer channel was blasted through the rocks in the early 1900s, many boats struggled to survive this section of the river. Some prospectors hired professional pilots familiar with the rapids, while others attempted the crossing alone with disastrous results. Boats overturned, cargo disappeared into the water, and inexperienced travelers sometimes lost everything within minutes. The rapids themselves were formed by resistant volcanic rock standing against the river's flow. Instead of cutting straight through, the Yukon River split into several narrow channels, creating the five fingers appearance that gave the rapids their name. Even today, standing above the river, it's easy to understand why this place became one of the most feared sections of the journey north. Dawson City still feels more like a frontier town than a modern Canadian community. In 1898, Dawson became one of the fastest-growing towns in North America. Tens of thousands of people arrived hoping to strike gold, transforming what had been a remote settlement into a chaotic boomtown almost overnight. Gambling halls, saloons, dance venues, and supply stores operated day and night while prospectors flooded into the region. But the boom didn't last long. Once the easiest gold deposits disappeared, many miners moved on, and Dawson's population collapsed dramatically. What remains today is one of the best preserved gold rush towns on the continent. One strange local tradition still survives here: the Sorto cocktail. Visitors can order a drink containing a real preserved human toe, and to officially complete the challenge, the toe must touch their lips. The tradition began in the 1970s and has since become famous far beyond the Yukon. Gold mining also continues around Dawson even today. Modern operations still search the surrounding creeks and valleys using heavy machinery far larger than anything the original prospectors could have imagined. And beyond the old gold fields, the scenery suddenly changes again. Tombstone Territorial Park is one of the most dramatic landscapes in the entire Yukon. Jagged black peaks rise directly above wide tundra valleys, creating scenery so sharp and rugged that many visitors compare it to fantasy artwork rather than a real place. The park gets its name from Tombstone Mountain, whose dark shape reminded early prospectors of a grave marker. But what makes this area truly special is the geology. Unlike the rounded mountains seen in many other parts of Canada, these peaks were never fully covered by glaciers during the last ice age. As a result, the mountains remained steep, rocky, and heavily eroded over millions of years. This region also marks the transition into the subarctic tundra, Trees begin disappearing, replaced by low vegetation, mosses, and open valleys stretching toward the horizon. During autumn, the tundra explodes into intense red, orange, and yellow colors that attract photographers from around the world. Wildlife here includes grizzly bears, moose, wolves, caribou, and golden eagles. Because the terrain is so open, animals can sometimes be spotted from surprisingly far away, moving across the valleys below the peaks. And once the paved roads end beyond this park, the Yukon begins feeling even more remote. Dempster Highway is one of the most isolated roads in North America. Stretching more than 730 kilometers, that's over 450 miles, from the Yukon toward the Arctic Ocean, this gravel highway cuts directly through mountains, tundra, and enormous wilderness, with very few settlements along the way. And unlike most major roads in Canada, large sections remain completely unpaved. During heavy rain, the surface can become muddy and difficult to drive, while winter brings snowstorms, ice, and extreme cold. Drivers often carry extra fuel, spare tires, and emergency supplies because help can be extremely far away. But the scenery is what makes the highway unforgettable. The road climbs over high mountain passes, crosses broad tundra valleys, and eventually passes beyond the Arctic Circle. In autumn, the tundra turns vivid shades of red, orange, and gold, creating one of the most colorful landscapes anywhere in the north. Wildlife sightings are also common here. Caribou migrate across the region in huge numbers, while grizzly bears and foxes sometimes appear surprisingly close to the roadside. And because there are so few artificial lights, the night skies can become spectacular during the colder months. But once darkness fully settles over the Yukon, the sky itself sometimes becomes the most extraordinary part of the entire journey. Northern lights in Yukon are one of the main reasons many travelers visit during the coldest part of the year. On clear nights, green ribbons of light begin moving across the sky, sometimes slowly drifting above the mountains, other times exploding into bright waves that seem to cover the entire horizon. The science behind the aurora is surprisingly complex. Charged particles from the sun collide with gases high in Earth's atmosphere, producing flashes of color that can appear green, purple, red, or white, depending on altitude and atmospheric conditions. But standing beneath them in person feels far less scientific than it sounds. What makes the Yukon especially good for viewing the aurora is the combination of northern latitude, dark skies, and relatively dry climate around some regions. During strong solar storms, the lights can remain visible for hours, shifting shape constantly above frozen lakes and snow-covered forests. The Yukon is one of those places that's difficult to fully understand until you see how enormous and untouched it really is. From gold rush towns and dangerous river rapids to Arctic highways and mountains buried beneath ice, this territory still feels far wilder than most places in the modern world. And maybe that's exactly what makes it so fascinating. Because the Yukon isn't about crowded attractions or famous landmarks around every corner. It's about space, silence, distance. The feeling that nature still completely dominates the landscape around you.